Anzetse Were, welcome to BRI Dialogues on January 21st, 2022. Time flies. You're in Nairobi. Anush and I are very excited to be having this conversation with you about Africa and BRI. But one thing that caught my attention is that you are what I call a deveco, a development economist. And you've been on this journey for a good 10 years, since 2013. And 2013 is the actual date and timing that the One Belt, One Road initiative, or BRI Dialogues as it was conceived, came together. How would you look back over the past 10 years in the impact of BRI and feeling, or what is claimed to be feeling, the infrastructure development gap in continent of Africa as a result of BRI?
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Professor Anush, for having me. I mean, I think obviously over the evolution of the way BRI has been evolving, I think the first premise obviously was to fill an infrastructure deficit. And I think that infrastructure deficit was informed by both the China side in terms of trying to make sure market access was something that was a bit more feasible, but also on the Africa side, we've long wanted serious infrastructure development that perhaps had less conditionalities than had been the case with traditional partners. Then as we saw that evolving over time, you know, we saw the burgeoning of the trade with China as well, in addition to the infrastructure. And then as China's presence, and particularly its lending, became more prominent, the geopolitics started to inform a lot of now, not only the way China views the relationship, but obviously the way Africa and obviously Europe and North America view the relationship. So you've seen an evolution from a very functional relationship around infrastructure, obviously with, you know, like all states have their objectives of their foreign policy objectives. And you've seen that more functional relationship transit into a much more soft power relationship, still though, functionally important and relevant to Africa because our infrastructure deficit remains quite serious. And I think the interesting thing is that before China sort of came forward, there'd sort of been this view that, yeah, we're not really going to deal with infrastructure in Africa. That's not what's important. And, you know, the Washington consensus is sort of the view that they had. But suddenly now that China's come through and they've seen the level of appetite, not only that Africa has, but now the other partners, you know, Turkey's coming in and other people with their capabilities and infrastructure. Now we certainly see the global north feels like it's time to re-engage. And it'll be very interesting because China now has obviously 20 years of experience in this, and the global north basically has not been doing that much at scale for 20 years. So it's a very interesting time now, particularly in the infrastructure development space for Africa.
And that is really interesting. Thank you for that. It's like China has woken the rest of the world up about Africa's importance and the opportunities in Africa. So some say that 21st century is Asia's century, but you could argue that actually, in many ways, it should be Africa's century, given the potential that there is in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And China's arrival has sharpened the minds of the West, who, of course, had a field day in Africa, and indeed the old Soviet Union. So much of Southern Africa has still got Soviet kind of legacies around it. But to focus on China for a minute, given your expertise and the experience that you have in this area, what is the scale of China's investments in sub-Saharan Africa, and exactly which territories and which sectors has China focused on? Because there is so much ambiguity and fog of disinformation about this, that it'd be important to have this clarified by someone of your stature.
Thank you, Professor. I mean, precisely, the biggest misperception is this idea that China owns Africa in terms of lending. But if you look at the actual lending that Africa is exposed to, about 43% is actually to private creditors, about 30% is to multilaterals, and then about another 30 is to bilaterals, right? So when you look at the way Africa, because sometimes people don't understand fiscal policy, so then they don't understand what debt means. When you look at the type of debt a country gets into, there are two main types of debt. There's domestic debt and then there's external debt, right? Domestic debt in Africa is substantial. In countries like Kenya, the public debt portfolio is about half, right? So this is not even with outsiders. Now, when you look at external debt, there are three main types. You've got the bilateral debt, which is just sort of the Africa-China, you know, Africa-UK. You've got the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, IMFs, and then you've got the sovereign bonds, the Euro bonds. So when you have that in mind, you begin to understand where China sits. China sits in the bilateral portion of that. So when you look at about the 30-35 that is bilateral, China is a tiny portion. That in Kenya, for example, China is only about 19% of our total debt portfolio. It's very large in the bilateral docket, but it's, so sometimes particularly when journalists don't really understand that composition, they sometimes take the bilateral figure and say, oh, and this was something that actually happened in Voice of America very recently. They said China owns 67% of Kenya's debt. It's like, no, it owns 67% of our bilateral debt, which is 19% of our portfolio. So I think that is the biggest misperception, is that people don't understand that composition. And so they take discrete figures and apply it to an entire debt portfolio when in fact that's not happening. So I think that's the first thing. Sorry, go ahead, Professor.
Sorry to interrupt you, Anzetse, but on that debt, who decides how the debt is derived at? Do African actors have an independent, autonomous role in that, or is China dictating this?
Yeah, you see, one of the reasons why China became so big in Africa is because they tend to be demand-driven. If you look at the way, particularly infrastructure, even now, and sort of the conditionalities around that, one of the problems African governments had is that they didn't feel it was a very demand-led conversation. It was a very sort of ideologically imperialistic conversation of this is what we think you should be building and this is what we're going to fund and these are our values, which is fine. But what China came with that is really important is that often African governments often have their own infrastructure plans, whether it's transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and it's like, okay, so who can we find to fund this? And so instead of China coming with a value-led, yeah, this is what we think you should fund, you should build, they were like, okay, what do you want to build and what can we pay there? This is not to say that there aren't vested interests, particularly on the Africa side, that are integrated into those debt deals. But the refreshing breath of fresh air that China brought is that it started with, okay, you guys have an infrastructure deficit, how can we support that? Now, the big challenge now for the Africa side is that we need a lot more coordination around our infrastructure development. I think one of the big things, particularly people in the global north don't understand, is how big Africa is. We are the largest continent by far on this planet. You can put China, India, Europe, USA in Africa, and there's still room to spare. So one of the things people don't understand is the scale of infrastructure that we need to just basically connect our continent. And so when China came in, that's why you see the appetite isn't going anywhere. The appetite for infrastructure is still there. And when you add the demographic component, which mind you is one of the big reasons now, I think Europe and North America are coming in. They're beginning to see the future of the world is in Africa. I think 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of the labor force will be Africans soon. And so that combination in particular, I think is important.
I'm very interested when you talked about debt portfolio and the share and this breakdown. Would you concur, or what are your thoughts on the fact that the ballooning debt of the continent of Africa historically by multilateral, bilateral, and other actors other than China, despite IMF underwritings, the whole thing has left very little to show for? So it's part as well the impact, not only the portfolio and the weight, but what is there to be shown in Africa. I remember when Theresa May visited Kenya, she was the first prime minister to step in after 30 years. So continent, as Anush was saying, has been forgotten. And is there an aroma, you think, of, I would say, a patronizing dialogue still towards Africa and understanding the real needs of Africa from the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, that's a very heavy question. The patronizing thing is, I think, related to African just being seen as a commodity in the global capitalistic system. But to be fair to the global north, the reason why people don't feel their presence so much is because the bulk of their spend is in social infrastructure, which is enormously important. If you look at the sort of spending Europe and North America have done, particularly in health and education, some countries in Africa cannot run their health and education dockets without the money of the US and Europe. Like this should not be overlooked. So one of the interesting things that I think now they're quite interested in coming into infrastructure, if you look at the political economy of infrastructure development in Africa, the reason why African leaders like infrastructure, apart from the infrastructure deficit, is that it's flashy and it's tangible. You can say, I built this road and I built this railway. Whereas when you look at the social infrastructure investment, which is incredibly important in health and education and agriculture, what are you really going to say? You know, there's no real tangible evidence of it. Of course, you have a more educated populace, but there's no shiny project that you can point to. So I think in many ways, Europe and North America have not really gotten the credit that they deserve in the role that they have played in building the human capital on the continent. This is not something that I think should be overlooked. And I think part of the reason why it is overlooked is because they do tend to come with a very patronizing attitude. And so it does make people feel a bit, irritated. And I think we just heard President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa had this speech last year where he says, we're really tired of this patronizing stuff. You guys really need to start seeing us as equals. We are no longer in the dark ages. But that is not to say that their contributions haven't been important. The other big space where I think Europe and North America have played a big role, and I wish that they do this a bit more tactically and present it a bit more strongly, is in private sector investment. The role that they're playing in building out our private sector cannot be understated. I mean, if you look at particularly in the tech space or just in the new Africa space, right, of younger Africans, I'd say 30, 40 below, that are coming through and starting to build out our private sector. Again, European and North American capital is indispensable there. They really have an ability to put together a bouquet of financial vehicles. In a way, China isn't there yet, frankly. I think China will catch up, but they're not there yet. So I think that's part of, the problem with what's happening is that Europe is looking at what China is doing and trying to compete on that. But it's like, you guys have such deep inroads in our social infrastructure and our private sector investment. Why aren't you focusing on that and strengthening us? And that's why I always say I think the way that Europe and North America spend in Africa and the way China spend, it's complementary. We don't really see this competition in that sense.
So you're implying basically that this should be marriage made in heaven in terms of
what
Africa's needs are, that China can do the physical, while the West, particularly Europe, but also United States, can do the human, if you like, side of this. And yet it's competition that seems to be driving these powers rather than cooperation, which takes me to my question regarding this, the perception of what China is after in Africa. You implied earlier in response to our questions that actually China's role is demand driven, demand from the African side rather than from the Chinese side. That is the African countries and African leaders who aspire to develop their infrastructure, their economies, and China is a very able and willing partner in that regard. But there is also discussions that I'm sure you follow in the West about China having a hidden agenda of wanting to acquire rare earth minerals, for example, that infrastructure services China's access rather than African integration. So first of all, do the infrastructure actually cross boundaries? Are China's contributions developing African continent's integration, or is it like the colonial times where they are putting pockets of infrastructure for their own interest? And the other part of it is, what are they doing in this kind of access to rare earth minerals? Is there a conspiracy to hand or not?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, you have to bear in mind that the infrastructure development is articulated through the national level plans on infrastructure. China can only do so much. China can't come in and make the continent. The same way China can't come in and fix our trade problems. This is the political economy of transport infrastructure in Africa cannot be underestimated. And while there are theoretical attempts to coordinate, I think we've seen the practical side of things can be quite difficult because of the sense of competition. I mean, I think definitely the misperception that Africa is acted upon, that Africa is, China is a neocolonial power. This is one of the most bigoted views of Africa, I think, that is done at the peril of the global north. Because you have to understand that this view of a primarily extractive understanding of Africa is not a Chinese invention. This is a global north invention. If you look at the way Africa first interacted with the capitalistic system, this modern capitalistic system, we were the product, we were the slaves. We were being auctioned like tea and coffee. And then that transitioned into colonialism, where then they came to extract our land itself and basically steal our land. And so we fought them off. And then now it's natural resource extraction, right? So it's quite ironic that, the global north is blaming China of the things that they've been doing to us for over millennia. So that irony is not lost on us. And I think the real problem with that is that it continues to infantilize Africans and to dehumanize us and make us seem as though we're nothing more than sort of glorified simians throwing rocks in caves, and that people can just come in and that we're just sort of oblivious, almost a real infantilization of our capabilities. And I think in the past, they were able to get away with that because of the sheer violence that sort of was inflicted on Africa in the process, whether that was slavery or colonization, or even in the post-independence era where we had proxy wars. I don't think people understand how much violence Africa's been subjected to. And it's really been, I think, probably since the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, that we're trying to get a semblance of a sense of peace and stability. And this is not just to blame the global north. We've obviously, as African, have our own civil conflicts, but that has been reticulated through centuries of violence. So when this narrative is conveniently placed on the Chinese, I think there's this view that we don't have a memory, and that we don't understand where a lot of this rhetoric is coming from. And I think that's what really irritates Africans, because you have to understand that the global north isn't even asking itself, why did China get so big in Africa? This is a fundamental question they're not asking. One of the reasons China got so big in Africa is, one, they don't have this imperialistic colonial history with us. They were not doing the slave trade with us. If you look at the post-independent era or the fight towards independence, China, even though it was during the Cold War, actually tried to help Africans in the freedom fighting, particularly in Southern Africa, to get the colonizers out. So China didn't have this sort of colonial imperialistic history. The other big reason why China got so big in Africa is because there isn't this sense of assuming that you know what's better for the Africans, which is sort of the foundational view of the global north, is that we need to teach the Africans how to develop. Even the term development in itself assumes that we need to reach where they're reaching. Whereas in Africa, we're like, well, do we really want to reach a stage where we're over-consuming, where we're just hurting the planet as we exist? Is this really a model that we want? And so these are the things that I think China brings to the table that the global north is still struggling with.
I had goosebumps when you started creating and painting that value chain about we were the first commodities with our bodies as slaves, and then land as agriculture, now minerals. And that triggered a question follow-up, Anzetse, about brains and human capital. And 80 to 90% of African industries are SMEs. So when you talk about the contribution of global north, as you call it, and we will have a conversation a little bit later about this terminology, I have my own thoughts. How is that brain movement at the moment? Do you have a reverse migration? Is the human capital being served the way you talked about health and education in propping up these startups, and or the potentials in Africa? And then this danger of single story, which is a famous TED talk. How can Africa break out of this to resonate this message, not one single bite here or single sound bite there? How can you think as an expert that Africa should really fight back this narrative?
Yeah, I mean, we have been fighting back, and we do have a very rich history of constant critique, not only of ourselves, but of sort of the way external forces continue to interact with us. I think you cannot force people to listen. That's what we have learned, is that you can't force people to listen. But I think we are reaching a stage where if you're coming to Africa with that bigoted view, you're just going to end up being played, as we say. You're just going to end up making a mess of things. I think on the SME side, on the idea side, this is a new frontier of extraction, frankly. I mean, if you look at that thing, from us being the slaves to the land to the resources, now the new frontier is ideas. If you want a good idea, go to Africa for 2 weeks and you'll come back with a bag full of ideas. And the real problem that we have, that I have, particularly in Africa, I'm old, yeah? In Africa, the average age is 19, 17. So I'm viewed as an older African. The real problem that we're having is that our young people are not being compensated for all these ideas that they're presenting in the hope that maybe it will lead to, their business being funded or, some sort of income generating opportunity. And so what we're seeing is almost, in addition to, just this extractive mentality in terms of our natural resources, which continues, is this vulture capitalism. This sort of view of we're going to go to Africa, get the ideas, and then we'll put together the PowerPoint to get the funding for it. This is the new frontier of extraction, and it's a real problem. I think that said, I think Africans are stepping up and saying, well, this is not okay. We're not okay with this anymore. And the reason why that's happening is, one, nobody who comes to Africa, even if you stay in Africa for 2 years, you will not understand what's happening. You need an African to help you, particularly if you're talking about market penetration, scaling, private sector, understanding consumer habits, where there's basically no data you can refer to. You need to have people understand what they're talking about. What people are beginning to see is that you can fund people with flashy PowerPoints, but you really need to have people understand your niche market to make the inroads that are required. And that's why we're seeing this new appreciation of an African force of private sector. And I think this is something I really saw over COVID. Whereas before we saw a lot of startups sort of founded by European and North Americans that are African, yeah. Now we're seeing the real Africans saying, no, we're the ones who know how to run businesses in our countries. We're the ones who understand the soft power you need to understand consumers or to get the networks that are required. And so right now what we are seeing is this evolution of this extraction of the ideas will continue. This is just something, I don't know how it will be fixed unless people just get a sense of enlightened self-interest around it. But on the other hand, I think what we're seeing is a much deeper pool of African private sector that are a bit more responsibly, not perfectly, but a bit more responsibly taking the helm of that and trying to make sure that our people are actually taken care of and that the ideas are rewarded to the right people and not people with nice suits and PowerPoints.
You know, as I said, we should have called this the onion dialogues, because with everything that you say, I see another layer that I want to unpeel, and it's brilliant to have somebody of your experience and knowledge to be unpeeling this onion for us. So 3 questions, and I'm going to monopolize it because I know Ali wants to come back as well. So let me put 2 sides of a coin to you. The first side is whether from the sub-Saharan Africa perspective, the separation between development and democracy that is part of China's brand is received more willingly than the Western model is one thing. The other side of the coin I want to put to you is this, that perhaps some of sub-Saharan Africa's resolve may be coming because they know there's a China behind them, not as an ally, but as a backstop, as an alternative, that they no longer have to go with a begging bowl to the IMF and look at all these white men to decide their fate, that actually there is another level of interaction at least, going on that can give them a degree of self-confidence, if you like. And the third little one is, when I look at sub-Saharan Africa, I'm deliberately leaving North Africa out of this because of their Mediterranean and European connections that kind of repackages them geopolitically. But looking at sub-Saharan Africa, I only see pockets of economic vibrancy, right? It doesn't seem to be running across. And there are, even also where there are vibrant countries like South Africa in particular, but I also look at place like Namibia, which is showing huge potential and so on. There isn't this blanket desire to grab the bootstraps and move forward as a community of states. Why is this continuing to linger?
I'll start with that question. I mean, part of that is a perception problem because we're not good at presenting data. I mean, the way our private sector is structured, it's highly informal. This is one of the biggest problems Europe and North America have in interfacing with us, that China is actually cracking now. So they're figuring that out pretty fast. But when you have a very informal private sector, you don't have the data, the numbers, and the narrative to explain what's happening. As a result, the view is that, oh, nothing's happening in Africa. But once people come to the continent, they're like, oh my gosh, there's so much happening. That said, there is a problem with the way a lot of our economies are structured. This part of it has to do with just decisions made in the post-independent era that I think were just foolish, but part of it has to do with the colonial legacy. If you look at the way our economies were structured, our economies were never structured for Africans. Our economy is always structured as sources of inputs for other parts of the world. And this is a legacy you see in countries that are very dependent on fossil fuels, whether it's Angola or Nigeria. This is also things you see in countries such as Kenya, which are very agricultural commodity based, where, basically we're still, a lot of agriculture is still servicing tea, coffee to other parts of the world that we don't consume, that we don't process. This has been a very difficult nut to crack in terms of how do we get Africa out of this so-called resource curse where we're just being extracted from to the value addition. And this again is where there's a narrative, oh, Africans, you guys, aren't working hard enough. But I don't know if anybody has ever tried to change the value chains that have this level of political interest in them. Even if you go to something like a tea value chain, let's not go into the minerals and metals because that's a whole other animal. And you try and change a situation to where Africans are the ones adding value, you will run into very, very serious vested interests. Yeah. And I think people underestimate how serious that is because the current arrangement in global value chains, where Africa is the resource provider, everybody else is making money from it. Why would they want to change it? And so I think people don't really understand that. And don't get me wrong, there are also Africans in Africa who benefit from the current arrangement. And so what you're talking about is a seismic shift in the way global value chains operate. Now you're beginning to understand how decisions made in DC, New York, and London directly reinforces global value chain. So sometimes you wonder, what is an African SME meant to do this? Is their job to solve that problem, or is their job to try and figure out within the remits of what they're capable of and within the remits of their resources, how can we make inroads? And that's why I'm always going to be a champion of African private sector, because despite a lot of vested interests, both domestic and foreign, they still find a way to create solutions for African people. So I think that's the first question. I think to the last question, I think to answer the first question, the autocracy-democracy debate, I mean, first of all, I think you have to bear in mind that autocracy is not a Chinese creation, right? Autocracy is something that was happening in Africa during the heart of the Cold War, financed by the global North, Europe and North America in particular. If you look at the Congo crisis, you have to understand that when Africans got independence, African countries, the bulk of that was during the heart of the Cold War. And so what people sometimes don't understand is that African governments didn't really have a choice to chart their own way. I mean, we had people in Tanzania like Nyerere who tried to. He was trying to create this African socialism, but he ran into problems. But what really we were set with is that either you're going to go with the West or you're going to go with USSR. And so what ended up happening is that, again, our development priorities were sublimated within that border agenda. And that's how you end up having people like Patrice Lumumba being assassinated and then Mobutu being installed for decades. Even though he was so-called capitalist, there was nothing about what he was doing that was taking care of the Congolese. And so I don't think people understand the terrible cost Africa bore during the Cold War, not only in terms of creating a leadership culture that was not accountable to Africans, it was accountable to either the Soviet Union or to London and Washington. It was not accountable to the Africans. And this is the legacy of the leadership style that continues to dominate. There's still a struggle for this sense of accountability to the people. And of course, Africans are the first ones to tell you our leaders do not have us in mind. And this is part of what's happening. Now, I raise that because when you look at the vein and the texture of authoritarianism and autocracy in Africa, it is not necessarily ideologically driven. This is a big mistake people make. Autocracy is usually about power and using whatever convenient ideological construct there is to make sure that your power is retained. East Africa is one of the most authoritarian parts of Africa. Yeah, people don't understand this. Yeah, and autocratic. And for some, they say that's good. That's why East Africa is one of the most stable regions in Africa. If you look at Rwanda, if you look at Ethiopia, these are countries that have been posting growth figures, that have been baffling the West. And that's why you see sort of this contradiction in the West, where it's like on one hand, they'll be praising Rwanda for, oh, your growth and oh, you're doing so well. But at the same time, that's an autocratic state. Same with Ethiopia until the recent civil war. They were posting GDP growth 5, 7, 8 consistently. Oh my gosh, Ethiopia, miracle of Africa. It's an autocratic state, right? So I think this is the confusion in the global north. They can't figure out where they're falling on that. But I think you have to understand that the autocracy now is sort of also, from a leadership perspective, it's like democracy is too slow and it costs us too much. If you look at the democratic planning cycle in an African country, you basically have 2 years of proper action, because you have the first year where everybody's sort of settling in after the elections, and you've got about 2.5 years where the new government is in, and then you've got the next year and a half of elections. What does that do to planning? What does that do to technocratic consistency? And most importantly, which I've seen in the work I do, technocrats are like, we can't complete this in 5 years. If you want us to do proper economic transformation, we need to be on this path for 15 years. But now a new government comes and now you're just changing. So you can see that for some African countries, they're like, forget that. We're just going to be authoritarian and autocratic and we're just going to get it done. I'm of the view democracy is still better because the brutality of authoritarianism and autocracy in Africa is not to be underestimated. It is absolutely brutal, both historically and currently. And of course, I think for the African people, democracy is still what they prefer. But that's sort of the background that I'm giving you. It's never that simple. And so the West needs to ask itself, is democracy working for, democracy doesn't even be working for them. If you look at sort of the divergence in prosperity in Europe and North America, we're asking what's happening. Your people are starving, your people are homeless. Like your own democratic promise is not working for your people. That's unknown for Africa. Is the democracy promise really, really working? And I think that's the question that they fail to answer. And then to start to say, you know, China is making you guys autocratic. It's like, no, this is not how it's happening.
Well, listen, I think that, as Anu said, this is onion sessions, because it's just, but not bringing tears to my eyes out of, crying, but out of enlightenment. So a lot of the stuff that you're talking about of the value chain of small and medium-sized enterprises, one thing that regularly in your commentary you share is global North, global South. And listening to you, I realize a lot of these legacies are from the past. So I want to suggest moving forward, both Anush and I and yourself, we use global North as global past and global South as the global vast, because of the opportunities it has. But let me take that and follow a lead out of my fellow dear partner here and pack 3 questions. So my 3 questions are as follows. One is about these stories that pop out of that, oh, China is seizing assets, in Uganda, in Entebbe airport. And then they go and dig and they say, no, it's not that. They're not taking the asset, they're taking revenues from the asset. Where are these stories coming up? Number one. Number two, the role of infrastructure. You talked about education and healthcare. I've come up with a terminology called diplomacy, which is vaccine diplomacy. If that has been the case, what are the penetration of vaccines in the light of COVID at the moment in Africa, and how well those things of equity, of distribution and fair distribution have taken place? And last but not least, I want you to kindly help us understand and decompose. I know I'm packing a lot in these 3 questions, but I know Anush will come after me. So what is South Africa in this whole picture? And where is South Africa as a massive economy with all these institutions and everything that is happening? And in the absence of the beautiful, charming Arch Desmond Tutu, what is left there to be unpacked? And is South Africa, the next anchor for China on the continent?
I think the first question, when you're saying about the misperception in the commentary, I mean, I think I've said this before, it's just this determination in Europe and North America to paint themselves as the good guy, to paint China as the bad guy, and to create a false dichotomy. This false dichotomy is not the way Africa sees the world. And I think just to answer the question that Professor Anush raised that I forgot to say is that it's not that we're getting brave because of China. It's also because the global North is not the bloc that it used to be. Yeah, that's not whether it was Brexit or even the way North America sort of and the US has sort of drifted to its own way of doing things. I mean, that multipolarity is real. And African governments always like us, we're not dealing with, East-West. We're dealing with a multipolar world where India is a serious player for us, where Russia is a serious player for us, where there's Japan, there's South Korea, where there's the US, where there's China, where there's the EU. Even EU, it's like, no, within EU, there's G7. Do you see? It's a multipolar world, and this is the way Africa sees it. And so this narrative of, asset seizure narrative or the debt trap narrative is so 1970s in its construct. I mean, I don't know who comes up with some of the playbooks. It's like, are these just like the old guard coming up with like 70s playbooks on narratives and propaganda? Because it's so old school in the way it's presenting itself that it's so easy to unravel. And it's only a matter of time before it just is completely disbanded. And I mean, if people choose to believe it, that's fine. But what they realize is that once you come on the continent, you're going to see very quickly that that's just not the way it works. And it's better for you to just understand.
Anzetse, I want to weave into that this is not something that is coming from Anzetse Were sitting in Nairobi. American universities go dig and then they come out and they say, we didn't see a trace of that. So that is what I wanted to
That's exactly it. It's Deborah Bottenham in Johns Hopkins University, it's Boston University, it's African universities, it's Chinese universities, because I mean, I'm an academician in many ways, such as you, and I'm a scholar as a scholar, and we want to find out what's happening. And I think that's why it's like this 1970s of like, we will just tell them, even though the facts are different. And as I said, we live in a digital age where, you know, Google is your friend, but some people don't seem to know that. But so we're in a multipolar world. This is the way Africa sees it, and this is the way it will continue. I mean, I think to your point about the dynamism, the economic dynamism of Africa, particularly South Africa, I think you should probably bring a South African expert in there. South Africa is a very unique situation because of the terror of apartheid and how it just stymied particularly Black economic empowerment in that country. I think in East Africa, we had almost a similar situation where the view in East Africa, I think also people don't understand the model of colonization in Africa was not the way it was in other parts. Like in East Africa particularly, the model of colonization was we were settler colonizers. They wanted us to be like the US and Australia, they wanted to settle. You know, and so we really had to fight to get them out, you know, and that was obviously the model that Southern Africa got. It was a settler colonization, whereas in some other parts of Africa, it was a bit more extractive. And so I don't think people understand that even within colonialism, you have different flavors and intensity, depending on the power that was being the colonizer force, but also depending on the specific objectives that colonizer had for the specific part of the world. But I think to the economic dynamism point, I think people, don't really understand, and I was trying to make this before, is that it's very difficult to dynamically transform an economy when you're in a consumption-based economy with very, very poor people. That's why when you look at economic development theory, things like foreign direct investment, you know, things like having an open economy, things like prudent fiscal policy, these are all things that are just such anchors, and also export-oriented manufacturing is very important because that's how you get external capital to come in, build your wealth. This is what China did. And then from there, you build your own internal consumption so that you can run as discrete units credibly. Africa has had all sorts of problems. That's a separate conversation in and of itself. But I think don't buy the idea that because we're not presenting our economic dynamism the way the global North or Europe and North America present their economic dynamism, that it is not there. I think, you know, COVID particularly, you know, even though it's completely decimated, I don't think people appreciate the level of divergence COVID has had. One thing that informality does, even though it makes you more vulnerable, it makes you a bit more resilient because you're able to find different pockets of money. And so, you know, I don't know how much longer Africans will continue to explain ourselves to people who don't listen. And I think part of what's happening is that those who come and those who do want to listen, that's who we work with. And those are the ones who end up getting a lot of traction in the African market. And just to see the sort of gains that particularly the Chinese private sector has made in Africa. I mean, you know, it's a bit different to the way the US is doing it, but they're coming in and waiting and building and supporting. And sorry, to the infrastructure point, I think you can't blame China for wanting to make sure it has the infrastructure to either get its goods in or to get the natural resources out. Because why? These are usually premised on the Africa development plans themselves. It's not like they tell us, build the standard gauge railway, or they tell you, build the KwaZulu-Natal. No, it's like, you guys want it, so you know, go ahead. But so I think it's really important to still center the responsibility of African governments in this.
And that's it. You know, I can keep talking to you for the rest of the day, and you're so generous with your commentary that it is really laudable. But let me pitch another one at you, and it's again one of my big picture stuff. Given the complexity of sub-Saharan Africa, and given the diversity of communities, of states, of economic levels, of demography, of resources, and so on, it is true that Africa can fit the rest of the world in its territory, but there is one African Union as an organization. So given that the rest of the world is regionalizing, for want of a better term, and that there are opportunities for Africa to function more as a unit, if you like, where does African Union sit in this, and how is China's relationship with the continent regulated if there is an African Union involvement in it?
Yeah, so the regulation is at the national level, but I think to your point, that is the spirit of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It is precisely that impetus that has created the African governments to come together and say, no, we're going to create a free trade area primarily for us to better trade within ourselves. And of course, external partners will come in and benefit that to whatever's possible. And I think even if you look at the economic blocks within Africa, we have economic blocks. There's the Southern African Development Community, there's the East African Community, there's the ECOWAS, so there's the COMESA. So we have already got our regional economic blocks somewhat better than others. But I think one of the things you have to bear in mind is that partly because of the short-termism of democracy and sort of the political thinking of democracy, that tends to undermine the long-term planning to get these things off the ground. So I'll give you an example of the East African community, which I know the best and which is considered the most advanced in Africa in terms of an actually functioning, semi-functioning customs union, free trade area. I mean, the real problem with that is the poverty of this view of the race to the bottom, right? So you'll have the East African community, and we're meant to be able to trade easily with each other, but because every country has its own national level development objective, that is what then informs their participation in the union, or their participation in the regional organization, the same way it sort of happens in Europe. And so what I've seen is that while there is an intellectual appreciation and commitment, as seen in the African Continental Free Trade Area, which I think and I hope will continue to have the momentum that it has behind it, what I've seen is that the pragmatic realities tend to interfere with that. Because, Tanzania wants, its national development objectives to be done through the EAC, so does Kenya, so does Uganda, so does Rwanda, same with the SADC. And sometimes what you need are more regional agreements, more regional forms of cooperation. And what I found is that there could be pockets where that regional view actually happens, but it's very difficult for that to be the consistent way that it happens, because Uganda wants to industrialize, so does Tanzania, so does Nigeria, so does South Africa. Everybody has their own plans. And are they in competition with each other? Yes, often they are, because particularly if you look at the natural assets on which industrialization is based, we will share common natural assets, whether that's the East Africa, will share common natural assets, same with Southern Africa. And so sometimes what happens is that the countries in the bloc or in the continent that are seen as to be smaller, they can be a bit paranoid that the bigger countries just sort of come in and take over. But then now the bigger countries are like, well, if we completely open up our markets, you guys will just cannibalize our markets, and our private sector won't have any consumers. These are the practical realities of regionalization that we're grappling with now, and that is a problem only Africa can solve. The way China is dealing with the AU, it's an interesting one. The AU is a very interesting structure, and I think it's getting more and more powerful and seen as more and more credible as time goes over time, particularly in its planning framework and sort of articulating, sort of a negotiated view across African governments. But you have to bear in mind the African private sector is sort of there doing its own thing. And obviously African civil society is also there doing its own thing. And so that's just the complexity of Africa, like everything else. And that's why now you begin to understand how absolutely foolish these one-dimensional narratives are. It's like, you guys clearly just demonstrate you have no understanding of what's going on.
Anzetse, I want to take you back to the common denominator about our vulnerabilities. And I raised the question about vaccines and diplomacy and the role of distribution and developing infrastructure and logistics is coming to play when something like this big happens. And we're not going to talk about some of the commentary or coverage about the short expiry dates of the vaccines that have been sent to the continent. Where is that significance been felt after COVID in terms of accelerating infrastructure development in Africa for logistics and distribution as a result of COVID? The second thing is climate change and climate finance, which is part of your expertise as well, this adaptation and mitigation. And how can this global north or global past come and tell the global south and the global west that stop using gas because we don't want you to have the bridge fuel. We want you to jump to all things electric. And by the way, we don't like the Chinese investment in infrastructure, but just switch to electric. How will all of these things reconcile together?
Exactly. So on the vaccine thing, I mean, this has just left such a bad taste in the mouth of Africans, particularly African governments. So beyond the infrastructure question, you need a lot of soft skills, as you know, to actually get vaccines deployed. And you need to fundamentally work with African health systems, African health professionals, and African governments in the health sector to actually get that done to scale. I have not seen a lack of willingness on the African side there. I think what COVID really taught us is that if we really feel like if COVID had started in Africa, would have been just locked out. And the world would have just said, okay, we're closing off Africa now, and the rest of us would just get on with it. And it would have just been left, you know. And there's a real sense of devastation, I think, that people don't understand that we're still not getting vaccines. Still, yeah, it's improving. And if you want specific figures, I think their bodies will track it. But when you're talking about parts of the world getting booster doses and Africans not even getting their first dose, and then being made to look like it's vaccine hesitancy is the issue. No, the issue is that there are no vaccines. Yeah. So it's been we've really felt it. And it's really shown the true colors of, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, number one, you don't want to give us the vaccines. Number two, you don't want to give us the IP. Either give us the IP and we do it ourselves and we sort ourselves out, or you give us the vaccines, and the answer has been no. Yeah, particularly from the Europe and North America, which is seen as more credible in pharmaceutical access than China, if I'm perfectly honest. And I think that stain is not one that Africa is going to forget in a very long time. Not to mention that when COVID first started, everybody was like, oh, millions are going to die in Africa. And so we're just sort of sitting here wondering, are you guys angry that we didn't die by the millions? Are you guys upset that Africans were not dying in the millions? That actually, when you look at mortality, we were doing pretty okay compared to other parts of the world. So there's been a real showing of true colors that COVID has done beyond the vaccine diplomacy side. And I think infrastructure is just a small part of that. I think the real problem is the actual soft skills and the social infrastructure required to actually get to these particular remote areas in Africa that require it. And so I don't know how that's going to be dealt with.
The reason I asked that was that when you touched about education and healthcare and the positive role of Global North, I felt there was a bit of a tectonic missing element on the COVID part of that. That's why
you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, if you look at the sort of the bias of the particularly health spending, and again, there are certain countries where I'm more familiar with the figures. It's really more malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, it's all sorts of diseases that sort of get the attention. COVID is new, and I think the sense we got is that they were trying to sort themselves out, which is fine. But even once that was sorted, there was still this, no, we're not going to help you guys. And so it's an irony because I think particularly the US and Europe had a much deeper set of hands into our social infrastructure and our health spending and the ability to leverage that constructively, frankly, for their own foreign policy objectives. It's got nothing to do with us, but they could have done that a lot more. But instead now, China is seen as the hero for COVID in Africa. China is seen as the one, even though it's not necessarily true, but it's seen as the one who said, no, we're going to come through. We're going to try and do what we can. We're Africa's friend. And only now later you start getting batches of Pfizer being thrown at Africa. So I think that was just poorly handled. And I think the problem with that is that COVID now is becoming a casualty of great power competition, where again, it's not like necessarily the view does not seem to be the caring for African lives. Now it's about how do we get one up over each other via COVID. Again, this view that Africa is a commodity in a game by other people, that we are not our own people with our own view of how we are going to do things. And so that one, I think they're the ones to sort out what they're going to do there. I think in terms of climate change, this is a very real issue. And I've discussed climate finance, which is one of the areas of expertise. I just have to say that when it comes to conversations around legacy contributions to climate change, the silence is deafening, you know, because we're being told, oh, climate change is a global problem, you know, we are all in it together. Africa is like, no, we're not. No, we did not contribute to this. Yeah, we did not really contribute to this problem. If anything, we've been subjected to the absolute devastating consequences. And now we're being told to dance and to twist ourselves into shape to get money to solve a problem that has nothing to do with us. Yeah. And again, the real risk from an African perspective is that climate change will become a casualty of what? Great power competition. Frankly, if you're looking at climate adaptation and mitigation, there's again a complementarity there between China and North America and Europe. China, if you want anything to do with the technical and technology side of climate change, you know, particularly the solar and wind, China has been an absolute game changer for Africa. If you look at the level of off-grid penetration that is happening in parts of Africa, that is because China is making solar panels at scale and at price points that make sense. On the other side, the financing of the climate finance itself, again, multilateral institutions have been important, and North American, European institutions have been important. But I think the lack of self-reflection or honesty of legacy contributions is stark.
Well, I'm gonna definitely with Anush go through this and so much of learning and unpacking, but I'm gonna ask you a fixed question that Anush and I always raise. From an African setting and where you are sitting, what is your biggest advice to xenophobes and xenophiles from where you are sitting? If you were to leave them with a message to take away.
I think they should consider that we have our own view as Africans, and they're going to find it increasingly difficult to just come with a pre-manufactured idea of who we are and make any traction on the continent. This is just going to be more and more difficult. We are not our forefathers. We thank our forefathers for what they did for us to get us out of slavery. We thank them for what they did for us to get us out of colonization, but we are not coming with that patience. We're coming with a real sense of it is now time for us to view us as the humans that we are, to view us as equals. And if you come with any one-dimensional view of, oh, China is the hero or China is the villain, when you come and actually deal with the Africans, the African continent, you're going to be having a very jarring, sort of strike of reality. So it's in your interest, perhaps, to whoever's listening, to perhaps listen to what Africans have to say, so that when you come, you can be part of the solution.
Thank you, Anzetse.
Dr. Anzetse, that is what I call a dialogue.
Thank you.
Absolutely extraordinary. I have learned so much from you and the insights that you have provided, but also to have an expert advocate, an enlightened academic are things, these are not terms that we can use loosely. And yet you so ably and fully demonstrate the values of humanity in what you do, and encouraging us to look at the world in those terms is absolutely brilliant. I'm hoping that many millions will watch our dialogue with you, and learn from what it is to be a true passionate scholar and expert, but also to listen to your words and learn from what you're telling us about how to engage with the most dynamic, rich, historically endowed continent that is going to shape the generations to come. To have someone like you to enlighten us could not have been more rewarding. So thank you so much for taking the time and to giving so generously to our dialogue, Dr. Anzetse. Very, very much appreciate your time.
If I may just add to that, thank you very much for giving so generously as your continent has been doing for centuries. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. It's been such a breath of fresh air engaging both with you, Professor Anush and Ali. Thank you so much. And I really look forward to seeing this, and I hope that it resonates, some things resonate with people. So thank you for the opportunity.
Pleasure to have you.